The well had no name. It was too old for that. Older than the house that once stood beside it. Older than the crumbled wall still wrapped in vines. Older perhaps than the road itself that curved away without ever truly reaching it. It sat low in the earth, not buried, not hidden, just undisturbed. The rim was made of uneven stone, some rough, others smoothed by the slow patience of rain. A circle that opened into something no one had ever measured, though many had tried once, and failed. Not for lack of tools, but for lack of will. For past a certain depth, the rope would no longer descend. The weight grew too heavy. The pulley would strain. And then, the silence would begin. People stopped trying decades ago. The land around the well became overgrown with weeds that did not belong to any known season. They bloomed late, withered early, and stayed dry even in rain. Birds passed overhead but never perched nearby. The wind would skip the clearing, as if it remembered something the people did not. And though no one ever claimed to hear voices from the depths, those who stood too close would often leave in silence, their hands trembling slightly, their feet unsure on the ground that had suddenly become unfamiliar. Nothing had fallen into the well in years, no coins, no wishes, no accidents. It seemed to resist intrusion. A child once dropped a stone, just once, and waited for the sound to come back up. He heard it, but not as an echo, more like a reply, not loud, not clear. But it changed the boy's face for the rest of his life. He moved away. His parents never said why. The house he grew up in is now a shell of splintered wood, its windows wide open to everything but the light. No one spoke of the well anymore. It was not avoided, just unacknowledged, like a book no longer read, though its cover still sits at the edge of the shelf. It did not call. It did not dream. It merely remained, waiting in a world that had forgotten how to wonder. Until, one morning, something changed, not visibly, not loudly, but unmistakably. The dew on the grass around the stones was missing, only around the well. The air above it was warmer, and just beneath the rim, barely visible unless you looked away and then back again, was the suggestion of a step. It did not look like a step at first, more like a shadow that failed to retreat when the sun moved. It clung just beneath the rim, not projecting outward, but folding gently inward, so subtly that it could only be seen if one did not look directly. And even then, it did not persist. It waited to be seen again, and again, as though it wanted to be remembered, not discovered. The shape of it was wrong, not crooked, not broken, just unresolved. It did not lead down. It led away. Downward only because that is how things fall. But this did not fall. It invited. By mid-morning, the mist that sometimes hovered over the field in spring had arrived out of season. It curled low against the grass, clinging to the air like breath too tired to rise. The birds had gone quiet. Not gone, just unwilling. Trees on the perimeter of the field shifted their branches in slight disagreement, as if deciding whether to stay or turn away. Nothing in the sky looked different, but the air tasted like something old had been disturbed, not by force, but by intention long delayed. The man came just before noon. No one saw him arrive, but his tracks were visible later, single unhurried steps through the dewless grass, not leading from anywhere, just toward. He did not carry anything. He did not wear anything unusual, just a long, weathered coat that hung like it remembered too much rain. His hair was unremarkable. His hands were clean. But his shadow, faint though the sun was, bent slightly the wrong way, as if cast by a memory rather than a body. He paused at the edge of the well and looked in, not out of habit, not out of ritual, but out of familiarity, as though he had been here before, or somewhere very much like it, though not in this life. He leaned forward, not recklessly, not fearfully, and placed one foot inside. The step accepted him. It did not shift or creak. It did not judge. It was as solid as forgetting, as familiar as the feeling of missing something, long before you knew you had it. And then, with no sound at all, he disappeared beneath the lip of the well. No one in the village noticed. Or they did, but in ways they could not explain. A plate broke on its own in one kitchen. A door swung shut against a breeze that wasn't there. A mirror fogged though no breath had touched it. Small things, forgotten things, pausing in the middle of being, as though the world, for one brief moment, had shifted its weight to the other foot. The inside of the well was not made of stone, not anymore. The first few feet still held the rough, cold surfaces of ancient masonry, but beyond that, where light usually failed, the walls gave way to something else, something that no longer obeyed the architecture of the world above. The stair that descended did not spiral. It turned, yes, but in slow, irregular motions, as if reacting not to gravity, but to thought. Each step was a little too shallow to trust, and yet no misstep came. It held his feet with a softness that remembered them before they arrived. The man did not hurry. Descent here was not a matter of distance, but of shedding. Something in the air slowed his breath, not in resistance, but in rhythm, like music composed for lungs instead of ears. The sound of his movement vanished after each step, swallowed not by depth, but by memory too saturated to echo. There were no walls close by, and yet he felt enclosed, cradled inside something vast that preferred to remain unnoticed. The shape of the tunnel was not circular. It folded inward, then softened, then reformed behind him in silence. There were markings here, not glyphs, not letters, not images, more like hesitations carved into the surface of time. Places where something had tried to begin, then stopped. Places where decisions had nearly formed. He ran his fingers along one, and it pulsed slightly, not in light, but in attention. It had waited to be noticed, and now it no longer needed to exist. The wall behind it smoothed itself again, erasing the moment with the mercy of release. The deeper he went, the more the steps began to lose their shape, not in substance, but in certainty. They remained underfoot, steady and tangible. But the distinction between one and the next blurred gently, as if sequence had become suggestion. There was no turning back, not because it was forbidden, but because there was no longer a direction to define return. Behind him, the path folded into itself. Ahead, it unfolded at the pace of his willingness. Each step was no longer part of a journey. It was a permission. Somewhere far above, light still existed, but it no longer reached him, not because of depth, but because of departure. Here, illumination came not from beyond, but from within the air itself. A soft glow that did not cast shadows, a warmth that outlined nothing, yet allowed everything to be seen. He could make out the curve of the space around him. Not smooth, not symmetrical, but organic, as if the well had stopped being a passage and become a chamber. One that breathed slowly, as though in sleep. He paused, not to rest, but to listen. There was no sound, and yet there was presence. The kind that filled old libraries at night when no one remains but the weight of words unsaid. He placed his hand on the nearest surface, not wall, not floor, but something in between, and felt it yield slightly. Not give way, but acknowledge. It was neither wet nor dry, neither stone nor earth. Its temperature matched his own. And for a moment, he sensed something pass between them. Not thought, not message, just alignment. In this pause, he began to notice other things. Shapes nestled into the curvature of the space. Not objects, not furniture, but impressions. Like places where a lantern might have once hung, where a hand might have once hesitated, where someone might have stood long enough to leave behind the intention of staying. These were not memories, nor ghosts. They were almosts, the faint outlines of events that had nearly been. Not tragic, not incomplete, just unchosen. A figure lingered in the distance, but only in possibility. A shimmer of posture, a pause in the curve of the path. It did not move. It did not disappear. It remained in that delicate state of almost being, held in suspension by the well's quiet refusal to decide. He walked past it, or through it, or with it. It did not matter. It was not company. It was context. He continued, and the chamber narrowed again, not into tunnel, but into intention, as though the space had remembered what it was meant to become. The steps returned, more clearly now, firmer, willing. They did not urge him onward. They simply made onward possible. The sensation of descent shifted. No longer vertical, no longer directional. It felt instead like falling inward, toward something not buried, but ignored. The air had become stiller, but not stagnant. It felt curated, as if filtered through layers of events that had been gently removed. Each breath tasted faintly of dust that had never settled, like the aftertaste of interrupted rituals. He moved with care, not because of danger, but because each step felt like a promise to something undefined. On one wall, or what seemed to be a wall, he saw a line. Not scratched, not drawn. It appeared only when he looked at it sideways with his thoughts half formed. A single horizontal stroke, too deliberate to be natural. Beneath it, nothing. Above it, the suggestion of a second line, incomplete. He stared longer than he meant to, and for a moment he felt his name float just behind his eyes. Then it vanished, not stolen, but released. The line no longer existed, and he felt lighter for it. The corridor bent again, but this time the curve echoed, not in sound, but in recollection. He had walked this turn before, not in life, not in dream, in delay. In all the moments he had paused just before deciding something irreversible. The memory did not come with images or names, only the sensation of having once almost chosen. And this place had remembered that for him, had kept it safe, had now returned it, not as burden, but as shape. He saw another figure, this time lower, curled inward, perhaps seated, or perhaps still becoming. It breathed, but without lungs. He could feel its exhale as a shift in the surrounding quiet. It offered nothing, demanded nothing. It was not a warning. It was not a sign. It was presence, held in suspension, like a note in a song that would never be finished. The steps ahead no longer looked carved. They looked revealed, as if they had always been here, waiting for recognition to set them free. And with each one he moved closer to something that no longer needed to exist in form, but only in awareness. He reached a point where down ceased to mean anything. The well was no longer behind him, nor above. It had become a threshold that had closed silently, without resentment. The path ahead was not lit, but neither was it dark. It held no end, but also no uncertainty. It simply continued, like breath in a sleeping body. The man walked now not by steps, but by becoming. Each movement unwrapped a silence that had waited long for its listener. Around him the space trembled faintly, like the inside of a bell that had not been rung in centuries, not from instability, but from anticipation. The walls, if they could be called that, shifted with each blink, adjusting their shape to match the truth he had most recently forgotten. There were no relics, no bones, no inscriptions, only surfaces that remembered being looked at and now returned the favor. He felt the outline of things that had once considered existing, a bench never sat on, a question never asked, a door never imagined. They clustered gently at the edge of awareness, not seeking attention, but grateful to be near it. One of them, a faint shape resembling a coat hook, seemed to nod as he passed, though it had no form with which to move. He acknowledged it without gesture. Here, acknowledgement did not require performance. His body had begun to blur, not in shape, but in reference. The edges of him no longer mattered. What mattered was motion, soft, continuous, like water forgetting it was once rain. His footsteps left no sound, no mark, no sequence, only continuation. He no longer wondered where he was going. He did not need to know. For here the concept of destination had been gently retired. And still, the stairs continued. Not deeper, but further. Not into the earth, but into the quiet space between choices never made. He walked them as one might walk through dusk, not to reach night, but to remain within the softness that holds both light and its absence. And beneath his feet, The well uncoiled further still, patient, timeless, and ever aware. There was no longer a sense of being beneath, no sense of over or under, high or low. The man moved through a space that had released itself from direction. The steps still came one after another, but they no longer seemed anchored to descent. They arrived more like punctuation marks in a story he was not writing, only reading, slowly, reverently, with the hush of one who knows the page may change if read too quickly. The walls, or perhaps the boundaries of thought, had begun to ripple, not visibly, but in feeling, like walking through the skin of a forgotten dream. The surface was a memory now, but not a memory he carried. It was a memory the well held of him, a version of his shape, his intention, his pause, stored somewhere in the breath between the stones above. He had not left the world. He had simply become irrelevant to its motion. Here, things did not begin. They did not end. They formed, hovered, then settled into waiting. Even time seemed tired of trying to continue. A new chamber unfolded ahead. It opened not like a door, but like a sigh, reluctant, resigned, inevitable. The space was circular, but imperfectly so. Its curves slouched gently, as if the room were remembering how to be itself. Along the floor were grooves, not etched, not carved, but pressed in by absence, the kind of marks left by footsteps that never arrived. He stood at the threshold, letting the atmosphere lean against his body like fog unsure of its shape. In the center, there was a depression. Not a hole, not a pit, just an indentation, as if something heavy had once knelt here and then changed its mind. Around it, a faint ring of dustless stone, too clean to be natural. He did not enter the circle. He did not need to. Its meaning, whatever it had been, no longer required witness. It had performed its silence faithfully, and now asked only to be left unspoken. He turned instead to the far edge of the chamber, where a passage, narrower now, waited with the patience of something never used. The air grew thinner again, but not from lack. It was being refined, slowly, gently, until only what could be breathed without memory remained. He stepped forward, and behind him, the chamber dimmed. Not from distance, but from permission. It had released him from knowing it further. The corridor narrowed, but not in hostility. It grew intimate. The space curved tightly around him, not to squeeze, but to hold, as though the place itself wanted to be sure of his presence. The walls, if they were walls at all, had stopped resisting form. They now bore subtle contours, ripples like the inside of a shell, where the memory of growth had hardened into geometry. Light still came from nowhere, and still revealed nothing too clearly. It was not meant for clarity. It was meant for kindness, for things that no longer wished to be seen, but didn't want to be forgotten. He passed alcoves that were not recesses but hesitations, points along the path where the structure had paused, uncertain whether to continue. Some held nothing. Others shimmered faintly with the outline of intentions, barely shapes, mostly moods. One seemed to carry the echo of something being written but never finished. Another held the weight of a gaze that had never met its subject. These impressions did not call to him. They simply allowed his passing. His own steps began to change. Not their rhythm, not their sound, but their weight. He no longer felt anchored to motion. Each footfall became lighter, as though the ground had begun to remember him and no longer needed to be tested. The soles of his feet warmed slightly, not from exertion, but from recognition. The path accepted him more easily now, as though the well had ceased its examination and begun its invitation. He reached a bend that did not turn, but folded, a soft crease in the fabric of the path, like a page dog-eared by a moment of indecision. Beyond it, the space opened once more, but vertically this time. The steps began to rise, slightly, impossibly. Upward not in ascent, but in idea. He did not question it. There was nothing left in him that resisted contradiction. The well had no allegiance to direction. It curved toward what had not been needed, and offered it back with quiet hands. A shape waited near the top of the rise. Not a person, not a statue, a structure perhaps, but not built, more like formed, gently, by repetition, like something that had been stood beside too often. It resembled a threshold, though there were no doors. A frame, not for passage but for remembering. He passed beneath it, and for a moment every thought he had once abandoned flickered behind his eyes like starlight through water. Then it faded, leaving only the sound of a step that could not be heard. The walls began to shimmer, not with light but with uncertainty. They pulsed gently, like breath caught in the ribs of something too large to exhale. He walked slower now, not from weariness, but because the path had become less eager to unfold. Each step required more stillness, more agreement. The air was thick with unspoken decisions, layered atop one another like sediment. He did not feel watched, but he felt included, the way one feels when a secret has been shared in silence. At his left, a fissure opened, not violently, but deliberately. A soft fracture in the smooth continuity of the space. Within it, something moved, but not away. It undulated in place, like memory stirred by the wrong name. He stepped closer, and the space behind the fissure clarified, not into a scene, but into a feeling. The feeling of a room once entered too late. A seat taken before you arrived. A word spoken in your absence that changed the meaning of everything that followed. He did not enter. He did not linger. He bowed slightly, not as ritual, but in acknowledgement. And as he did, the fissure sealed itself, not hurriedly, but with the patience of something that knew it would be needed again. The corridor curved once more, but not in arc or angle. It shifted gently to the right, as if remembering a path it had once preferred. The stone beneath his feet began to cool, not with cold, but with distance. From what, he could not name. Ahead, the steps resumed their pattern, not in descent or rise, but in invitation. They stretched forward with the generosity of something that had always been willing but never asked. Each step carried a soft texture beneath his soles, like worn fabric on forgotten stairs. His body began to feel looser around its edges, not fading, just becoming less necessary to define. He paused at what might once have been a doorway, now just an arch of shadow bending into space. He passed through it without knowing. Only later would he realize something had shifted, not in him, but around him. A silence had joined his silence, one that did not need to be named. The next space felt wider, though its boundaries were invisible. He could sense the opening like a breath drawn in and never released. The floor flattened briefly. The steps paused. A hush spread across the air. Not silence, but the quiet that follows understanding. In the center of the space stood something that was not quite an altar, not quite a table. A platform, perhaps, raised only slightly, made of the same not quite stone as the walls around it. Upon it rested a single object, a folded cloth untouched by dust, colorless in the not light. He approached without hurry, each step softened by the sense that he was intruding not on a space, but on a thought still forming. The cloth held no pattern, but he sensed depth within its folds, as though it contained weight far greater than its size allowed. He did not reach for it. He did not need to. As he stood beside it, the air around the cloth shifted gently, like the breath of a long silent name remembered too suddenly. He sat, not on the platform, but near it, on a step that had not been there a moment before. It offered rest, not to the body, but to the part of him that had been carrying questions too quiet to form. He closed his eyes, and the space responded, not with movement, but with stillness that deepened. A stillness so complete that he felt himself remembered by the ground, not for what he was, but for what he had once almost become. No time passed, or perhaps all of it did. When he opened his eyes, the cloth was gone, not removed, just no longer needed. The platform beneath it looked the same. The space had not changed, and yet it had completed something. He stood again, and the step he had rested on dissolved without drama, folding back into the floor like breath exhaled without sound. The path forward narrowed again, not in warning but in focus. The walls drew close, gently urging him onward. He did not hesitate. What waited ahead was not an answer. It was simply the next silence. As the corridor resumed, a low hum began to accompany him. Not from the air, not from the walls, but from something beneath his awareness. It sounded like a memory humming to itself, not sad, not joyful, just present. It followed him at a respectful distance, never touching, never demanding, but always near. The steps here were softer, more worn, as if others had come before him, but not in body, in longing. Along one side of the corridor, the surface changed. It became reflective, not like glass or water, but like the inside of a closed eye. Shapes moved within it. Not his reflection, but approximations of presence. He saw versions of moments that had never been lived. Himself, perhaps, walking other paths, choosing other words, pausing at other wells. These images did not accuse. They simply existed, side by side, woven into the curvature of the wall like veins through marble. One moment lingered. A hallway, too familiar to be forgotten, but not his. A table with 3 chairs, one always empty. A clock whose hands had never moved. As he walked past, the image dissolved, leaving only the impression of having once arrived too soon for something that never began. He breathed slowly, and the corridor darkened slightly, not from fear, but from depth. The kind of darkness that belongs only to things that never needed the sun. The hum grew quieter as he approached the next bend. It was no longer a sound. It had become a rhythm, his rhythm, as if his heartbeat had tuned itself to the frequency of the well. The path opened slightly, revealing another chamber. Not large, not grand, just necessary. It curved inward, a shallow bowl of space holding no object, no altar, no memory. Just presence, like a palm open not to give, but to receive what had never been held. He stepped inside, and the hum stopped, not abruptly. It settled, folded into the silence like a final note held just long enough to matter. The chamber did not ask for anything. It offered no hint of purpose. But as he stood in its center, he realized something had changed behind him. He turned, and where he had entered there was now only wall, smooth, complete, as if he had always belonged to this moment, and the path before it had merely been rehearsal. He did not panic. The closing of the path behind him felt less like being sealed and more like being chosen. The chamber around him breathed slowly, not through air but through presence. The stillness was complete, yet dynamic, like being inside a word just before it is spoken. He stepped to the edge of the room, though no edge could truly be found. The walls curved continuously, refusing corners, refusing definition. Then came the first sensation of movement, not from his body, but from the floor. It did not rise. It did not descend. It simply remembered that it could shift. The entire chamber began to turn, not rapidly, not even smoothly. It rotated in thought, in suggestion. He stood still, letting the motion carry him not in space, but in context. The world around him adjusted slightly, as if positioning him in relation to something that had not yet occurred. At a certain point, the floor stopped, not with finality, but with readiness, and in front of him a seam appeared, a soft vertical fold in the wall, barely discernible except by the way the air leaned toward it. He reached forward, not in command, but in agreement, and the seam opened. No sound, no resistance, just passage. Beyond it, steps again. Not familiar, not new, just next. He crossed the threshold and immediately sensed a thinning. Not of space, not of time, but of assumption. The well had begun to peel away the final layers. What remained was not man, not memory, not motion, but something shaped by all three. The steps ahead were narrow, not in width, but in intention. They led into a passage that no longer curved, no longer opened. It proceeded in a single line, straight into the unknown. He took a breath, not of air, but of silence, and descended. The straight path did not feel final. It felt distilled, as though all the meandering before had been an attempt to delay what could no longer be postponed. The walls on either side were smooth, not from wear, but from the absence of resistance. They did not press close, but they refused to fade. They walked with him, adjusting with each step, their texture matching the tempo of his breath. There were no markings, no thresholds, no pauses, just forward. The air here had weight, not heavy, but expectant. It curled into the hollows of his chest like memory reclaiming space. His limbs moved freely, yet each step seemed to echo through something larger than stone. There was no sound, of course, but he could feel the shift, like pages turning in a book he could not see. As if his presence was being read, chapter by chapter, by something that remembered the story differently than he did. Up ahead, the corridor deepened, not in darkness, but in meaning. The color of the space grew quieter, retreating into tones beyond gray. The light, still sourceless, softened until it no longer illuminated, but suggested. Shadows did not return. He had long since stopped casting one. But now, faint outlines formed around him, not of his body, but of ideas. Regret, hope, loneliness. They moved like the breeze of forgotten decisions, not haunting, not accusatory, just near. Then came the mirror. It did not look like one. Not at first. It was the same height as the corridor, the same shape, the same color. But the air shifted when he approached it, hesitating slightly as though unsure whether to pass through or reflect. He stepped closer, and the surface did not show him. Not his face, not his outline. It showed the moment just before he had first seen the well. The stillness in his hands. The question he didn't ask. The weight in his bones that hadn't yet become motion. He did not reach out. The mirror did not shimmer. It simply remained, holding what he had been without judgment. Then it rippled, not in reaction to him, but as if it had finished watching. The surface dissolved, and behind it, a narrow passage opened, folding back into the unseen. He passed through it, and the corridor resumed. But now, with each step, the silence began to change. It no longer followed. It accompanied. The silence, once passive, had begun to pulse, not loudly, not invasively, but like a presence learning how to breathe. It no longer simply accepted his steps. It leaned into them, pressed softly against his movement like water that had grown familiar with the swimmer. The corridor bent once again, this time in a long, slow curve. The path did not steepen, yet each step required something slightly more. Not energy, not resolve, but awareness. As though the act of continuing meant peeling back another layer of forgetting. The walls had begun to carry texture again, not roughness, texture, impressions that changed with each blink. For a moment he would glimpse the edge of a window that wasn't there, a door frame without a wall, then nothing, just smoothness. The surface offered no history, only potential. It was not showing him what had been, but what could have formed if the right question had been asked. And then, not asked. The air grew warmer, gently, like the inside of a home no longer lived in, but still holding the memory of fire. The scent shifted too, not fragrant, not rank, just present, like fabric stored for too long beside a forgotten intention. His breath slowed to match the rhythm of the place, and for the first time he realized he could hear his own heartbeat again, not through his chest, but through the floor. It echoed gently, as if the well had begun to mimic him. A narrow archway appeared ahead, not decorative, not monumental, just a threshold with no purpose except transition. He stepped through and the silence responded, tightening, then loosening, the way a hand might squeeze and release in understanding. Beyond the arch, the corridor vanished, or rather, it dissolved into something without walls, a hollow without containment. There was space, there was ground, but the boundaries of the place had grown abstract, uncertain whether they were still needed. And within this openness, A shape waited, low to the ground, unmoving. It was neither invitation nor obstacle, just something that had remained. He approached and saw that it was a bench, worn, sturdy, not made of wood, not made of anything he recognized, but it looked sat upon recently, as though absence had only just risen from its seat. He did not sit. He paused beside it, letting his weight settle without contact. The air around it was dense with moments that had chosen not to happen. He walked past the bench, and the ground beneath him shifted, not in form, but in confidence. The floor, once unwavering, began to waver slightly with each step, not enough to threaten balance, but enough to suggest that steadiness was no longer guaranteed. The surface was still firm, still real, but it asked him quietly, "Are you certain you wish to continue as yourself?" The question did not arrive in words, nor did he answer it, but something inside him softened in reply. A sound, not quite a bell, not quite a breath, passed through the space ahead. It lingered like a thread in the fabric of the air, vibrating without tone. The passage grew darker, not from the absence of light, but from the presence of something else. A heaviness, a density of memory that had compacted into shadow. Not sinister, not painful, just weighty. He entered it like a swimmer slipping beneath water too still to ripple. Within the darkness, visions came. Not sharp, not defined, but gentle impressions. A room with too many chairs and no table. A child's hand reaching toward a window just before forgetting what it wanted to see. A staircase ending at a door that refused to exist. These were not his memories, but they recognized him, and in that recognition, they loosened. One by one they drifted away, returning to wherever the well kept such things when they were no longer needed. As he moved forward, his body began to feel foreign, not in pain, not in disrepair, just distant. His arms moved because something expected them to. His legs walked because the floor still welcomed steps. But he no longer felt that his shape was essential. He could dissolve if the well asked him to, not into nothing, but into belonging, a kind of surrender that held no loss, only return. The darkness began to pale, slowly, as if reluctant to give way. The heavy quiet lifted by degrees, replaced by something cooler, thinner, a lightness that did not come from above, but from within. He was emerging, not from shadow, but from the need to see. The path ahead glimmered faintly, not in welcome, but in readiness. Something further awaited. And for the first time he realized he was no longer alone. He did not see her. Not exactly. There was no form, no body, but something, soft, steady, moved beside him. A presence without pressure, a companion made of proximity. She did not walk. She was, a familiarity that refused to become name. He did not turn toward her, did not look, but he adjusted his pace slightly, not in deference, but in harmony. The corridor widened enough to accommodate the invisible. The air between them shimmered faintly, like breath between words never spoken. The path ahead began to shift in color, faint shades of blue and silver replacing the ambient gray. The walls were gone again, or perhaps had become irrelevant. What held the space together now was memory, not of moments lived, but of moments imagined together. Futures dreamed beside another body, possibilities once whispered and then folded away. They walked through a forest of silences, each one distinct, each one shaped like a conversation never had. One hung in the air like the pause before forgiveness, another curled along the floor like the space between goodbyes. The ground did not echo, but it responded, vibrating subtly with the presence of two who once might have shared the same room in another life. Their steps became syncopated, not identical, complementary. At one point, she paused. He felt it, though his steps did not. He slowed, not out of politeness, out of understanding. Something had called to her, a silence she had left behind, now returning like an old scent. He kept walking, and she followed again. No explanation, no sound, just the mutual agreement of shared presence returning to motion. The corridor began to curve downward once more. The steps reappeared, gentle inclines rather than descents, as if the path remembered it was once part of a spiral. And as they walked, the space began to narrow again. The openness receded. The air grew denser, not in confinement but in intimacy, like being drawn into the heart of a whisper. He felt her fade slightly, not retreating, not lost, just thinned into the air, diffused like warmth leaving skin. He did not reach for her. He had never truly held her, and now her absence became another kind of company. He walked into a space that resembled a room only because it ended. The walls closed gently, forming a perimeter not of stone, but of silence. The ceiling curved low, the floor dipped slightly, and in the center stood a pedestal, not high, not ornate, just a rise in the floor, flat-topped, unmarked. Upon it sat a single object, a box, sealed, plain, and older than the air around it. He approached, each step weighed with stillness. The box had no lock, no hinge, no seam. It looked untouched, and yet it radiated the unmistakable tension of something waiting. Not to be opened, but to be understood. He stood before it, not with the intention to act, but to witness. And in his presence, the air thickened. Not dangerously, just deeply, like breath pulled inward and never released. The walls began to hum, a low vibration, barely audible. The sound moved with rhythm, pulsing in sync with something internal, his heart perhaps, or hers, or both. The box remained still, but around it, impressions began to form, echoes of memories too fragile to become image. A hallway at dusk, a scent of dust and warm linen, a footstep that paused just before turning back. These were not stories. They were the bones beneath them. He did not touch the box. He didn't need to. His presence was the key, and the box opened without opening. It unfolded within his awareness, and what spilled out was not light, not sound, but sensation, the unmistakable feeling of having once been understood completely, and then forgotten. A kind of love too precise for language. It entered him without pain, without joy, just fullness, completion that asked nothing more. He stepped back. The box was gone. The pedestal faded next. The walls held their shape a moment longer, then softened. He turned, and where no door had been, an opening now waited, narrow, dim, welcoming. He passed through it, and the silence closed gently behind him. The passage narrowed once more, but this time without hesitation. The space had stopped questioning him. It had accepted. Around him the air shifted like fabric drawn close. The corridor pulsed with the quiet regularity of breath. His own shape had grown quiet too. He no longer felt edges, no longer felt the need to keep his weight. He moved like a name whispered only once, then held forever in the space where it was heard. There were no more walls, or perhaps they were so close they had become skin. He walked inside a presence now, not beside it, not beneath it, but within it. A presence that did not ask, did not speak, only remembered. Everything he had been, everything he might have been, everything he had almost chosen and then gently declined. It remembered with kindness, with patience. The path ahead dipped, not down, but deeper, into something softer. He stepped carefully, not for fear of falling, but for reverence. The ground beneath his feet began to change. It no longer felt like stone. It felt like thought. Each step echoed inside his chest, as though his heartbeat now beat against the shape of the place. And as he walked, he saw lights begin to gather, not in flame, not in glow, but in presence. They hovered, uncountable, soft. Each one pulsed with the rhythm of a silence once shared. He stopped when the space asked him to, not with voice, not with force, just presence. He stood still and the lights moved around him, forming a circle, loose, gentle, ancient. He closed his eyes, and within the darkness he saw every step he had taken, now walking toward him in return, not to undo, not to correct, but to complete. And then Stillness. He stood in the stillness, and the lights drifted like the hush after meaning. Each one pulsed gently, not in brightness, but in memory. They did not illuminate. They did not warm. They simply existed as if recalling every time someone had almost spoken the truth and then chosen silence instead. He raised no hand to touch them. He did not need to. Their motion responded not to gesture, but to intention. The moment he accepted their presence, they parted, slowly, respectfully, leaving a path ahead shaped not by ground, but by decision. The space into which he stepped was softer, not in material, but in tone. It felt lived in, though nothing here could be called home. The floor undulated slightly beneath his feet, not as instability, but as breath, like walking across the back of a sleeping animal that had chosen not to wake. The lights faded behind him, not extinguished, just unnecessary beyond that point. Ahead, there was only darkness, but not empty. The kind of darkness that held memory like soil holds roots, long since forgotten. The path narrowed again, this time not as corridor, but as thread. He walked carefully, not from fear but from recognition. The space was shrinking, not to confine him, but to shape itself around his exact size. Every step forward was not into new space, but into a version of space that had always been waiting for only him. The walls, invisible though they remained, adjusted to his shape, his rhythm, his breath, not 1 inch too wide, not 1 inch too tall. He began to notice sound again, not from the world, but from within himself, a kind of low, resonant hum, like the sound of breath held too long. His own heartbeat had grown quiet, and yet it thudded against the sides of this narrow passage with surprising insistence. The well had never truly been silent. It had merely waited for him to hear what was always there. Each step became heavier with that awareness. Not burdensome, just true. The tunnel began to curve downward again, impossibly so. Not like a spiral, but like the looping of a thought refusing to end. He followed it, not because there was no other path, but because there never had been. The space around him thickened, less like air, more like water. His movement slowed, not by force, but by reverence, like walking into a chapel where even footsteps feel like intrusion. He lowered his gaze without knowing why, and that was when the stair appeared again, not ahead of him, but below. It had returned, gentle, familiar, waiting. The stairs were not carved. They were not placed. They had formed, gently, patiently, out of the space itself, as if the passage, at last, had chosen to define itself again, for his sake. He stepped onto the first, and the air adjusted, not colder, not warmer, just tuned. The sound of his foot touching the surface was not audible, but felt. A soft vibration that traveled upward through his spine and settled behind his eyes like recognition arriving before the thought could form. These stairs did not spiral. They descended in slow, irregular patterns, changing angle every few steps as though adapting to choices not yet made. There was no handrail, no boundary, just darkness that permitted motion and did not question it. At certain turns, the edges of the steps seemed to soften beneath him, like cloth gently stretched beneath bare feet. Other times, they stiffened, requiring more certainty. The descent responded to intention, and the intention, in turn, began to dissolve. He no longer knew why he walked. Not because he had forgotten, but because the question no longer applied. The well did not demand purpose. It invited the absence of it. He continued downward because downward existed, because motion itself had become a form of remembering, and memory here was the only compass. The walls returned, briefly. They shimmered into view on either side, just long enough to suggest shelter, then faded again. In those brief moments they bore patterns, delicate lattices etched in faint light, not language, not art, something between the two. A residue of meaning left by countless others who had passed this way, not as messages, as offerings, a handprint that never touched the wall, A breath exhaled with intention but no recipient. A song hummed silently into the stones. He paused at a landing, not by decision but because the stairs stopped. The platform was small, barely large enough to stand upon. Ahead of him, the path folded downward again, disappearing into soft shadow. But here, in this moment, he waited. Not because he was asked to, because he was allowed to. And in that permission, he felt something loosen, something that had been gripping the back of his thoughts since long before the descent began. He did not weep, but something within him did, quietly, with relief. He descended again, and this time the stairs changed. They narrowed slightly, as if the path was now asking him to pay closer attention, not to where he was going, but to what he carried. The air pressed inward, not heavily, but personally. Every breath felt like a question, every exhale a kind of answer. The stairwell began to shimmer faintly, not with light, but with memory. Not his own, but collective, like he was walking through the condensation of dreams that never solidified. At intervals he passed alcoves, small hollows carved into the sides of the descent, none large enough to enter. Within each, something pulsed faintly, not objects, not relics, but decisions, the weight of paths not taken, lives not lived, gestures withheld at the last moment. One held the scent of a meal never shared, another shimmered with the warmth of a letter never sent. He passed them without stopping, though each one recognized him as he went by, not as their author, but as one who understood what they had meant to be. The steps leveled again, briefly, and in that pause the silence grew louder, not in volume, but in presence. It was no longer the absence of sound. It had become a third companion. His breath, his footfalls, and now the silence, all moving together in rhythm. He did not resist it. He folded into it, like a shadow curling toward the shape it had once belonged to. Then came the turn. It was sharp, unexpected. The path bent violently to the left, and the stair beneath his foot reshaped itself mid-step. He did not fall, but he stumbled, mentally, not physically. The well had changed tone, the rhythm altered, the descent resumed with a new urgency, though the steps were no faster. They simply felt more aware of him, more present, as if the space had narrowed not in size, but in tolerance. He kept moving. One step, then another. The air had lost its warmth, not chilled, just clarified, as if the fog of forgetting had been burned away by some invisible sun, and now only what must be remembered could remain. He reached a landing unlike the rest. It stretched wider, broader, bordered by what could only be called walls, but they were not stone, not material. They shimmered like oil on water, their surfaces rippling with unspoken things. Across this platform stood a single frame, tall, rectangular, empty, a doorway without door, suspended between one moment and the next. Behind it, nothing, just continuation, but the frame itself pulsed faintly, as if it still remembered purpose. He walked to its edge and paused, not out of caution, out of respect. This was not an obstacle, it was a witness. The frame had seen others, many, too many, and it held their traces, not as ghosts, but as pressure, the way a chair remembers the shape of someone long after they've left. He did not step through. He stepped beside it, letting its presence rest quietly in his periphery, acknowledging it without disturbing it. Past the frame, the path narrowed again, but now the stairs shimmered slightly with each step. He looked down and saw that the glow came not from the material, but from within. Each step pulsed softly, not like light, but like breath, as if the stairway itself had become alive, a body made of path, a mind made of descent. He continued. At some point the air began to taste different, faintly metallic, like rain hitting old iron. He breathed it in, and something inside him shifted, like a door opening in a house he had forgotten he once lived in. His shoulders dropped slightly, his spine straightened, his fingers curled inward, then relaxed. He was not changing. He was returning. to a version of himself he had not known he had left behind. The stairs ended again, not abruptly, gently, like the final page of a book turning itself. The chamber before him was low and round, more echo than space. It did not welcome. It did not resist. It simply was. The floor sloped gently inward, forming a shallow basin. At its center, a pool. Still, dark, not of water, something thicker, memory perhaps, or the residue of presence itself. The surface did not reflect. It absorbed. Everything it touched vanished, not from sight, but from the need to be seen. He descended into the basin slowly. The air here was heavier, not with pressure, but with anticipation. He had reached a place the well had not offered to many, a place that did not forget. As he approached the pool, the silence deepened further, folding around him like velvet soaked in time. He knelt beside it, not because he was told to, but because kneeling felt like the only possible way to meet whatever waited beneath. He leaned forward, gazing into the dark, not hoping, not fearing, just waiting. And then the pool moved. A ripple, small and certain, spread outward from the center. It did not reach him. It did not need to. The movement was not physical. It was recognition. A slow nod from the past to the present, from what might have been to what had come. And in that ripple, he saw something. Not a face, not a scene. A shape, a moment. The one he had chosen not to live. The one that had waited, patient and silent, for acknowledgement. Not for correction, not for regret, just to be seen. He closed his eyes and the ripple stopped. When he opened them again, the pool was still. The shape had faded, but something remained in him. A warmth behind the sternum, a memory of possibility that no longer needed to ache. He stood slowly. The basin around him did not change. The path behind him did not reappear. But ahead, beyond the far edge of the chamber, a new step had formed. He did not hesitate. The stair that followed was unlike the rest. Narrow, ascending, but not upward. It led deeper by rising, defying every instinct, every rule he had come to accept within the descent. And yet it made sense. The further he climbed, the deeper he went. Into himself, into the well, into the space that lay between every step he had ever taken and the ones he had never dared. The walls did not return. The air thinned, not with lack, but with refinement. What remained was only what mattered. The thoughts he had never said, the emotions he had never named, the names he had whispered only in sleep. They gathered now, just behind him, not pushing, but attending. A quiet chorus of everything unspoken, following him like dust trailing behind motion. At the top of the stair, a platform. Small, circular, empty. He stood in its center. Above him there was no ceiling. Below, no floor. Only the idea of both, held in place by memory. The platform did not float. It simply remained. A fact in a place where facts no longer applied. And in that stillness, the air changed once more. Not in temperature, in recognition. The well knew him now, fully. And in that knowing, it asked nothing. He closed his eyes. The platform began to descend. Not swiftly, not slowly, just perfectly. The way a thought lowers itself into the heart when it is finally allowed to stay. He felt no fear, no urgency, only return. The descent no longer felt like going down. It felt like arriving. And below him, waiting like a breath never released, was the next silence. The descent had shifted once again, though now there was no path, no stair, no edge to trace with his eyes. He moved downward, or was it inward, without a surface beneath him, yet never fell. The air no longer resisted him. It accepted him fully, folded around his body like thick velvet pulled gently by unseen hands. Each movement brought him not into new places, but into forgotten conditions of stillness, the kind that once wrapped childhood afternoons in quiet, or hovered between the words never said at the edge of parting. Above him, nothing closed. Below, nothing opened. And yet he moved, slow and steady, like a thought returning to the one mind that could finally carry it. Around him, forms began to gather, not sharp, not detailed, but dense with feeling. They hovered at the edge of meaning, neither memory nor prophecy. Shapes of waiting, shapes of rest. He passed near something like a table, though it bore no surface, only the intention of support. Nearby, a shelf that held no books, but seemed heavy with unreadness. The space was not a room. It was an echo of one, something he had almost stepped into once in a dream, only to wake too soon, just as the doorknob turned. He reached nothing. He touched nothing. But every movement carried the weight of arrival, as though each gesture deserved acknowledgement, not from others, but from the moment itself. Here, solitude was not emptiness. It was attention, distilled. The descent slowed further until it could no longer be called motion. It became presence, thick, unmoving, constant. He found himself standing on something, though he had not stepped. It was solid in the way silence is solid, in the way grief settles into bone long after the ache has passed. The darkness around him shimmered, not with light, but with pressure, as if the world were holding its breath. Then, out of the stillness, a pulse, a single beat, low and slow, like the world remembering how to begin. It did not repeat, it did not invite, but it changed the air, the way thunder changes distance. He felt it ripple through him, not as sound, but as alignment, not with a place, not with a time, but with a version of himself he had never dared to be, and yet who had waited here, patiently, forever. He did not know how long he stood there. Time had stopped using minutes. It had become density, texture, something he passed through instead of counted. Around him, the dark began to shift again, this time not to reveal, but to accompany. The shapes that had lingered in suggestion began to take more definite forms, not concrete, not literal, but certain in the way the feeling of a place remains long after the structure falls away. He found himself within a circular space, low-ceilinged and wide, though no boundary declared itself with certainty. The ground beneath his feet was not ground, yet it held him gently, like the first floor a dream offers before turning to mist. The air moved in slow spirals, and in it a rhythm began to form, not sound, but anticipation, like something approaching without footsteps, without origin. At the center of the circle stood a pillar, not tall, not grand. It rose only to his chest, its surface covered in small indentations, dense, perhaps, or tiny craters, as though it had been rained upon by forgotten thoughts. He approached slowly, not compelled, not curious, but because the space left no other direction. The pillar seemed to hold something not visible, an absence so dense it became presence. He placed one hand near it, not touching, only close enough for the air to carry intention. And in that moment, the indentations began to glow, not all at once, not brightly, just one at a time, each spark like the recognition of a name he hadn't heard in decades, maybe never, yet somehow still remembered. The lights pulsed in silence, a constellation of almosts. He did not weep. He did not tremble. But something inside him bowed, not in sorrow, in completion. The pillar, it seemed, was not showing him his past. It was showing him the hollow spaces shaped by what never happened. Not regrets, not failures, just voids with names. The room dimmed again, gently, as if the moment had exhaled. The lights receded one by one, not extinguished, but folded inward like petals retreating at dusk. He stepped back from the pillar. It did not react. It had done its part, and now it returned to stillness, as though ready to wait another lifetime. Behind him, the path resumed. A single arch had appeared, leading downward again, but now, every step would be filled with what he knew he had once left behind. The arch led him into a corridor unlike the others, not in shape, but in atmosphere. It was narrow, curved, and dim, yet every part of it hummed with the memory of passage. The walls, if they were walls, bore soft abrasions, like fabric worn smooth by generations of brushing fingertips. The ground beneath his feet was impossibly quiet, muffling even the rhythm of his own breath. He moved forward as if through velvet, a thick, soundless texture that held each moment in suspension. Around him, the darkness breathed, not in fear or menace, but with patience. It had waited for him to arrive, not because he was meant to, but because he had chosen to. And in that choosing, the corridor had shaped itself accordingly. He passed through spaces that felt smaller than his body, yet never resisted his presence. The air did not tighten, but remembered how large he thought he was. There were no junctions, no doors, no decisions. The path continued in a perfect curve, not leading him forward, but folding him gently inward. He could feel the walls tracing the shape of a thought he had long avoided, a memory not buried, but deferred. It did not rise, did not speak, did not impose. It simply accompanied him, like a shadow returned without apology, and he let it walk beside him, saying nothing, asking nothing, just allowing it to exist. At the far end of the corridor, a circular chamber opened, not revealed, but unwrapped. It was small and warm, like a breath held in cupped hands. In the center lay an object, neither artifact nor altar, but a fragment, flat, stone-like, with a single groove running down its surface. He did not need to approach. The fragment had already begun its work. It was not meant to be understood. It was meant to be felt. And what he felt, standing at the edge of the circle, was the gravity of everything unfinished. Words never spoken, touches never returned, rooms never entered. The groove in the stone was not a scar. It was a map, not to lead him, but to remind him that every step he had taken had been accompanied by all the ones he hadn't. The chamber dimmed as he turned, not from his motion, but because the space had completed its role. The path that resumed beyond it was narrower now, not physically, but perceptually. It felt as though it could not contain distraction. The walls had vanished again, and he walked between silences that carried weight. Each step pressed into something deeper than ground, and each breath carried the hush of reverence. Ahead, there were no lights, but faint pulses of warmth, like the echo of a hearth recently abandoned, the memory of comfort rather than the presence of it. He followed not the path, but the feeling of belonging that hovered just beyond each breath. Then, gently, the space expanded, not outward, but downward. A spiral, not tight, but deliberate, opened below him, made of stairs not visible until stepped upon. They formed as he walked, accepting him without hesitation. These stairs did not exist for movement. They existed to mark transformation. He was no longer the man who had entered the well. He had not become something else. He had simply remembered what the world above had asked him to forget. The spiral curved slowly, patiently, until it reached a platform surrounded by stillness. The platform held a single object, a chair, old, simple, worn not by time, but by presence. It did not beckon. It did not suggest. It merely was. He sat, not to rest, not to reflect, but to be witnessed. The silence around him acknowledged the gesture. He felt, more than heard, a soft exhale from the chamber itself, like a teacher recognizing a student who had finally returned without needing to ask the question. The chair was not an end. It was a pause in a sentence long spoken and never concluded. He remained there, breathing slowly, letting the weight of things unsaid settle gently into the space between spine and memory. When he stood again, the chamber seemed to release something. Not air, not energy, but closure. The space behind him grew dim, not vanishing, but folding itself into silence. Ahead, a narrow stair reappeared, carved so finely into the darkness that it could only be seen when not looked at directly. He descended, not cautiously, but with the ease of someone who no longer questioned gravity. The steps felt warm beneath his feet, as if the memory of others had lingered long enough to pass through skin. The air grew thinner, not from lack, but from intention. It was filtering everything that did not belong here. Only breath remained. Only self. The stair led him into a room so still it felt unborn. It had no walls, no shape, yet it enclosed him entirely. In its center hovered a sphere, soft, pale, shifting in texture like cloud and pearl and bone. It did not float. It did not pulse. It simply remained, a witness older than presence itself. He stepped toward it slowly, not compelled, not afraid, just aware that what waited here could not be named, only received. He placed one hand near it, not to claim, but to acknowledge, and the sphere shimmered faintly. From within it came a movement, not of sound, not of thought, a remembrance of what he had been before shape, before memory, before becoming. And in that moment, he realized the well had never held anything except the space into which truths could finally fall without echo. The sphere did not offer him knowledge. It offered him absence, of explanation, of narrative, of need, and somehow that was more than enough. He let it pass through him, like a breeze in a cathedral whose windows never opened. The space dimmed once more, not from fading, but from resolution. There was nothing left to see, nothing left to interpret, only continuation, soft and unmeasured. A new path appeared, not straight, not curved, but drifting, like mist remembering the shape of water. He stepped into it with the ease of someone who had left behind the need to arrive. Around him, everything softened, the air, the light, the weight of thought. It was not erasure, it was acceptance. The stair returned beneath his feet, more suggestion than structure. He followed it down, or up, or across. It no longer mattered. Motion was enough. The silence had grown vast, but it no longer felt distant. It wrapped around him like breath returning home. The further he walked, the more he felt that nothing here belonged to him, and that was why he could belong to it. The space did not require his story, his form, his voice. It required only his willingness to remain unspoken. Ahead, something shimmered faintly. Not a door, not a chamber, not a sign. Just the presence of a next. The moment he saw it, it saw him. And he stepped forward, not into light, not into meaning, but into the gentle hush of a well that had never ended, because it had never truly begun. The shimmer ahead resolved itself slowly, not into structure, but into awareness. It was not a room, not a place. It was a moment stretched wide enough to stand inside. As he entered it, the world shifted, not in shape, but in consequence. The silence that had once followed him now moved ahead, guiding him not like a light, but like a memory, one that knew the path better than he ever could. The floor beneath him changed again, becoming firmer, more intentional. His footsteps no longer sank into stillness. They resonated. Each one landed with a weight that was not his own, as though others had stepped here before him carrying the same burdens he could no longer name. The space had no horizon, yet he could see distance. It had no ceiling, yet he could feel shelter. He walked forward into a place that remembered him, not by name, not by face, but by the shape of his longing. Around him, the air folded in slow, steady movements, drawing gentle circles like hands washing an old cloth. He passed through these invisible loops, each one releasing something from his body that had clung too long, regret he no longer recognized, sorrow that had forgotten its reason, questions too shy to become sentences. Nothing left him violently. Nothing was taken. Everything was returned, gently, to the ground from which it had never truly separated. In the center of that distance, though he had never approached it, stood a figure, or rather, the suggestion of one. It did not have edges. It did not hold light. It stood like a pause in grammar, a breath held just before meaning. He moved toward it, not because it called, but because it remained. And as he neared, he began to understand that it was not someone else. It was not him. It was what had been left behind when he first stepped into the well. A shell, an echo, a tender map of everything he had once tried to carry forward but could not. It turned without moving, and he did not meet its gaze. He met its memory. The moment stretched around them, not as meeting, not as reunion, but as recognition between things that had never fully separated. The figure did not speak, did not move, did not change. It simply stood, and in doing so, completed something. He approached it slowly, not to join, not to merge, but to witness. The closer he came, the less form it held. Its outline blurred like ink in water, not dissolving but dispersing, revealing not a person, but a pattern, woven from his absence, his hesitation, his shadow. It did not vanish. It became translucent, then transparent, and in its place remained only the faint impression of standing still. He stepped into that impression without knowing he had done so. Something shifted inside him, gently but deeply, like a door that had never been opened, swinging wide into a room long prepared. He stood straighter, not by posture, but by permission. His chest rose without breath, filled with a stillness that felt holy, without belonging to any god. There was no ceremony, no climax, no transformation, only inclusion. He had entered the part of the well that no longer held space for separation, not from others, not from memory, not even from time. The light changed, not brighter, not sharper, but more forgiving. It no longer revealed. It allowed. He turned, not toward anything, but away from what no longer needed to be faced. The distance he had seen before had folded into itself, replaced now by a soft path bordered by nothing but understanding. He walked forward, and as he did, his shadow returned, not as darkness, but as weightlessness. It walked beside him, quiet and whole, no longer waiting to be acknowledged. He passed through a veil of warmth, thin, barely there, like the air between two people who once shared silence without awkwardness. And then, ahead, the stair returned, final, unbroken, familiar. It did not rise, it did not fall. It simply continued, and in doing so, told him what he already knew, that the descent was never about depth. It was about remembering how far he'd already come. The stair no longer responded to his weight. It carried him, not lifted, not moved, but accompanied. Each step formed just before he placed his foot, smooth and warm, like stone long softened by weather and time. The air held no scent, no sound, no direction. Yet he felt completely surrounded, as if the atmosphere itself had chosen to remain very close, like a memory that never wished to leave. He did not question where the steps led. He had passed the point where questions served any purpose. What mattered now was the motion, the willingness to be carried by what had always been waiting. He reached a plateau, wide and circular, where the stairs paused as if to breathe. The floor was marked, not with symbols, not with words, but with textures that spoke in quiet rhythm to the soles of his feet. Each subtle shift in the surface told a story too old for language, too precise for metaphor. He stood at the center and closed his eyes, not to block out the world, but to make space for what was rising inside him, a sensation that did not swell or surge, but settled. Something like peace, not happiness, not relief, just the deep certainty that nothing more was needed. From within that quiet, a sound arrived, faint, rhythmic, the sound of water, not near, not far, not outside. The sound of water that had always been inside him, just beneath awareness. It flowed not in river or pool, but in lineage, through vein and dream and silence. It spoke of origins without beginning, of ends without departure, of continuity that had never required motion. He opened his eyes and saw that he was alone again, not because she had left, not because they had separated, but because this part required only him. The stair resumed ahead, and it welcomed. The stair narrowed now, not in punishment, but in precision. Its width matched him perfectly, not his shoulders, not his step, but the shape of his becoming. The walls reappeared, close on either side, smooth and dark, curving gently inward. They bore no texture, no marking. But he felt them pressing memory into his skin, not forcefully, just persistently, as if they needed him to remember what had already been accepted. He ran a hand along the surface as he passed, and the wall responded, not by echo or vibration, but by softening, briefly, into a shape his fingers had known once in childhood. A railing? A hand? A moment before falling? He descended slowly. The air grew heavier, but not oppressive. It was the weight of everything that had ever mattered gathering around him, ready to rest. The silence pulsed gently, aligned with the rhythm of his breath. The further he walked, the more he felt time dissolve, not in speed but in distinction. Moments no longer stacked. They curled inward, layering into each other like threads drawn tight across a loom of stillness. He passed through memories that never belonged to him and yet remembered them. A porch in autumn, a name shouted from across water, a window lit in a house where he had never lived. Then, ahead, a doorway. Not ornate, not imposing. A rectangle of absence cut into the wall, black, plain, absolute. He stepped toward it, and something inside him paused. Not in fear, in readiness. The door did not open. It simply ceased to be. And he walked through, not into a room, but into a clearing, wide, round, endless. No walls, no sky, just light that did not shine, but welcomed. And in the center of that light, something low and round and still, a well. It looked nothing like the one he had entered, and yet he knew it was the same, not its twin, not its echo, its return. The well sat flush with the floor, no rim, no stone, no moss, just an opening surrounded by perfect stillness. He approached slowly, every footstep absorbed into the hush. The closer he came, the more he understood. The well was not here to be looked into. It was here to be remembered. And he did remember, not images, not events, but conditions. The silence before the first word, the stillness after the last, the ache of something never lost, only paused. He knelt beside it, not to drink, not to fall, not to search, but to wait. The air around him felt like dusk, not fading, but folding. The light in the chamber did not dim, but it narrowed its focus, drawing in toward the center like the final breath of a story told too many times to ever need telling again. He placed one hand beside the well, palm flat against the floor. The surface beneath was warm, not from sun or fire, but from presence. Beneath that warmth, the faintest pulse. Not his, not the well's, but something shared. He leaned forward, not to peer in, but to offer the space above it the shape of his breath. The air stilled further, if such a thing were possible. Then the well responded, not with sound, not with image, but with release. The sense of something loosening within the core of him, something he had never touched, never named, yet always carried. It did not rise. It fell, gently, downward, as if the well had waited this whole time not to be filled, but to be returned to. He remained there, silent, unmoving, breathing in the way one does when there is nothing left to say. The well before him had quieted again, not in completion, but in contentment. It would remain, as it always had, and others would come. Not many, not often, but some. He did not need to know who. The space around him had begun to dissolve, not in disappearance, but in diffusion. Light spread evenly through every surface until the shape of the chamber became irrelevant. The edge of the well blurred, his own outline softened, and still he sat, the hush around him now indistinguishable from within. Eventually, he stood, not to leave but to participate in the act of motion one last time. The floor beneath him no longer held steps. There was nowhere else to go, yet he walked, slowly, calmly, as though returning to a place he had not yet left. Behind him, the well remained open. Not a hole, not a destination, but a presence. A space where endings waited patiently to be seen as beginnings. As he moved, the air thickened one last time, not with weight, but with kindness. Every part of the journey that had ever been folded itself into this moment. Every descent, every silence, every almost. He passed through the final threshold without knowing where it stood. The space behind him faded gently, its memory left not as story, but as warmth. Ahead, there was no new place, just continuation. He did not emerge, he did not ascend. He remained, in motion, in stillness, in the well, and beneath the world above, forgotten, ancient, infinite. The stairs continued to form, one by one, without end.